In my opinion, the main problem of the Rings of Power is the protagonist. Because a protagonist in the Second Age is a very complicated thing to do. Now, we can reflect on questions like why does The Lord of the Rings start with a single hobbit protagonist? Why is the info dump at the beginning so important, and why does it age very well when you actually read the book to the end? The answer is simple. The problem with elves, dwarves, and the men of Numenor is that they are all kind of weird. They are otherworldly. How can a regular person understand the perspective of elves, both wise and eternal, or men who are strong enough to humble the equivalent of angels? Because yes, in the world of Lord of the Rings, Sauron essentially is he's like a spirit created by the creator himself to shape the world and help his children, the elven men. What the point of what I'm saying is that hobbits are particularly well suited to be protagonists, and that's why they are protagonists of both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because they're a mix of common men and modern men. Hobbits are family and food focused. It would be no surprise to me if their favorite app would be something like Yelp or Google Reviews, so they could follow restaurants and choose where they're eating next. Essentially, hobbits ground the reader in the world of The Lord of the Rings, which is weird and alien and has crazy time frames and everything. And if you would pick the Men of Numenor or elves, you would have to be very careful because it could become a jarring mess really quickly. And the thing is, most characters of the Silmarillion or Acalabus are almost aliens to us. They wield great power, they live nearly forever, and they have huge knowledge of everything. So they could do info dumps in every 10 seconds. For instance, I'll take a more simple character from Acalabus, which is Isildur. Isildur is born 3 or 5 people removed from the king of Numenor. He is a grandson, then the son, and eventually a great lord and king who lives about 200 years, and he defeats Sauron. He commands huge armies and is close friends to almost every elf that exists. It would be a considerable work of writing to build such a character in a human and relatable way to the audience. To relate with these characters, their daily struggles, their passions, their dreams, makes the audience sympathize with them. Elves are problematic in many ways. Thranduil said in The Hobbit, 300 years, the life of a dwarf is a blink of an eye for an elf. The time frames of humans, dwarves, and men are very different. Another point of disconnection is simply the fact that the vast, overwhelming majority of the audience does not know how a medieval lord lives. Feudal systems are radically different in both mechanics and legitimacy compared to what we live in constitutional republics. In all ways, how a noble lives is alien to a modern person. Lords have servants to conduct almost every daily mundane task. Many people that interact with them are sworn to them, and they are sworn to higher nobles. This is very complex to show comprehensively to a modern audience. You have to be eased into it. Otherwise, it will make no sense and be uninteresting. When combined with the endless life of such elves, this exacerbates the problems to an extreme measure. Picking an elf, especially if you do it badly, cannot work in my opinion. It makes all time frames unrelatable to the audience, plunging the audience into a bizarre alien world. Event an elf's life flow through time by centuries, skipping the equivalent of 10 men's lives between scenes. Picking a human is also alienating because it turns a show into a Game of Thrones ripoff. Further, it is stifling in narrative ways because as mortals, it limits what the character can live through to few events in the Legendarium timeline. So a human protagonist makes the narrative around the Rings of Power impossible. Maybe if we could follow a bloodline through key events, but that would mean introducing new human characters every few episodes, and you would have to age the other characters out. Yet it would barely ameliorate how much you can relate to the protagonist. Noble men who live hundreds of years are somewhat complicated to build to the audience. Further, they only intervene more than 1,000 years after the forging of the ring. Picking a dwarf character is difficult because dwarven culture is little developed in the lore. Further, dwarves are more alien than even Numenorians are elves. Further, the time frame of their lives is comparable to the men of Numenor. Yet, another problem is they only intervene twice in the Second Age. After the fall of the Western Elvish realms, they let some elves cross Khazad-dûm to go inform Lorien on the other side of the mountain, and they also send regiments at the War of the Last Alliance. Our last possible race of protagonist-making characters are the hobbits. They are good protagonists, yet there aren't really any halflings in the Second Age. It's okay to have a halfling protagonist, but writing one will be complicated because it must not impede on the events of the Second Age. Further, even if you had a nice cast of halflings, they cannot cover the events of the Second Age because the events of the Second Age happen so far apart, pretty much. So no protagonist except an elf can cover effectively and well the events linked with the Second Age. This is one of the problems that the creators of the Rings of Powers are facing. They can only use elves and using elves makes the story really difficult to actually like create well, like because elves are alien and bizarre. Men and dwarves, they can't cover the events and they're still hard to relate to, and hobbits, who are kind of Tolkien's preferred protagonists because they work very well as protagonists and they illustrate the themes of Tolkien very well. They don't have the lifespan to cover the period. So the result of this protagonist problem is the breaking of the world of the Legendarium. The Legendarium has a complete history where events often happen years or decades apart. Some things take time, sometimes they take a lot of time. When Numenorians leave their homeland to sail to Middle-earth to build settlements, this takes time, maybe decades, maybe hundreds of years. When Alfarazon is the last king of Numenor out of a total of 26 kings who each rule for at least decades, sometimes even hundreds of years, that takes a lot of time. And the other problem is the men of Numenor don't intervene in Middle-earth. At least they intervene very little. Like they found like small settlements. They only intervene after the forging of the Rings of Power, and that's in the second half of the Second Age. And the fact is that only the people who actually really run the Second Age are the elves and Sauron. So and you can't really have other characters intervene, like not intervene for a long time, because like the forging of the Rings of Power takes place over a few hundred years from 1200 in the Second Age, which is the arrival of Sauron in Eregion, to 1697 when Celebrimbor dies and Sauron steals all the rings except the Elvish and Elven rings. So now we can arrive at how I think the problem should have been taken care of. So the solution to both the problem of horrible time frames, the solution that characters don't make sense, is a solution that you need a protagonist that can actually live in the Second Age is simple. The solution is to use a cast of elvish characters, which they kind of tried to do, but they did it really badly. So I would introduce a young elf character that would follow the events of the forging of the rings, and that character would be born in the Second Age, so we can actually follow how an elf lives in the elvish realms. So we could have episodes where he's very young and he's kind of taught the world, like, so we don't have a shitty prologue in the beginning that makes no sense and that's jarring. So we just have an elf born in the Second Age, and at some point, like maybe a brother or an uncle of that elf gets murdered because he was I don't know, he was on a diplomatic mission to somewhere in Middle-earth and he gets murdered, and our young elf leaves either Lindon or Eregion, and he goes on a quest to go and find who murdered him and why. And so you have like a murder mystery, and this happens like 3 or 4 episodes in, once our protagonist is like he's like come of age. Like he's born in the beginning of the Second Age, so when he's like 300 or 400 years old. Oh, also what's as good is that we can slowly like introduce background events of the Second Age during our character's use, so they're not jarring and they're not happening all at once like they are in the series. so it's not a complete fucking mess. And also we can have the young elf, like he can like wander through Middle-earth in like an episodic fashion. Like he can meet men, he can meet hobbits, he can meet everything. And on the other side of our elvish cast of characters, we can have top elvish lords. We can have Celebrimbor, Galadriel, Gilgalad, and they can have plots around diplomacy, the crafting of the rings, and those things, they can happen only when they need to happen according to the timeline. So we can have like 3, 4, 5 episodes where we don't really see those characters. So when we see those characters, it's kind of like it's interesting, it's eye grabbing. But the thing is, they elevate the series, and our elvish protagonist elevate the series. And the thing is, our elvish protagonist, the advantage with it is that it can be their own character. So I don't know, like what happens, I guess, when you arrive at this maybe 1 or 2 seasons in after like Celebrimbor's death. Our elvish character can die. She can die in the war against Sauron if it's a woman. For example, it can be a woman. It has no problems with that. And then after our main character's death, in the next season, like season 3, what they do is they introduce the Numenorians. And the Numenorians arrive to they confront Sauron, and then we have a completely Numenorian cast. And sometimes we have like cameos from the important Elvish lords, and we can just like have this series be very interesting like that. But the thing is, the shift is kind of like warranted because in the second half of the Second Age, the elves are now too weak to actually fight Sauron effectively. They really need the help of Numenorians. So that's how I would fix the series. If you have any questions or any suggestions, please ask, and I will do a video to answer. Thank you, and have a nice day, especially if you watched this video to the end.